of course, fiction can't work and do justice to the infinite, opaque complexity of actual people. Or at least it does do justice to them, but not by being an exact representation. So this isn't my mother and my aunt, but it borrows things from them.
Hello, I'm Elena Lappin with another episode of Shop Talk with Writers, a monthly podcast where we dive into the stories behind the books we're reading right now. This podcast is the creative child of a very small but very active group of people: publicist and creative consultant Catherine Stroud, musician and audio producer Max Anstruther of Start Small Studios, and myself. I stole the title Shop Talk from Philip Roth's book of conversations with other writers. The author-to-author talk is a more revealing kind of interview because we can't help being curious about one another's craft, among other things. You can listen to this podcast on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. The podcast is hosted by Substack, where I post each episode with a feature piece about the author I interviewed. My guest today is novelist Tessa Hadley. She's the much-praised and award-winning author of 8 novels, including Accidents in the Home, The London Train, The Past, Late in the Day, and Free Love, and several collections of short stories. Her stories appear regularly in The New Yorker. Her latest book is the novella The Party, published by Jonathan Cape. The Party is a window into a wintry night in the life of 2 young sisters in post-war Bristol, a night which neither is likely to ever forget, and nor will the reader. Tessa Hadley, welcome to Shop Talk. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm Tessa Hadley, and I'm reading from my novella, The Party. The Party is divided into 3 chapters, and the middle chapter is the domestic one, where my 2 sisters, who in the outer chapters are adventuring out into the world, but in the middle chapter, they're at home. And at the very end of the chapter, they are trying to make their mother, who they think is rather old and worn and hasn't kept herself up properly, they're trying to make her beautiful for an evening out with their father. The marriage is ropey, it's on the rocks. And they sit her down in front of her dressing table and they make her up. Their mother put on the blue dress Moira had made her, with A-line brocade skirt and velvet bodice, cut with a draped neck and 3/4 sleeves. They sat her down at the walnut veneer dressing table in her bedroom. "Old fright," she said, gazing mercilessly at her reflection, but coquetting her head on her neck nonetheless out of habit. She wasn't really old. She was 43. But that seemed old enough to her daughters, their youthful beauty crowded into the reflection in the mirror behind hers, affecting not to look at themselves, only stealing side glances. Then Moira took her mother's face between her hands and turned it toward her, bringing her own face close so that they mirrored each other, each unconsciously mimicking the other's expression. Catching the tip of her tongue between her teeth in concentration, Moira smoothed basic dew onto her mother's worn cheeks, then powdered them and gave them a faint touch of colour, penciling in the arch of her eyebrows and painting her eyes with eyeliner and mascara. "Not too much," Rose anxiously said. "Trust me, it won't be too much." Working tenderly around her wedding ring, Evelyn rubbed lotion into those hands which still smelled of cooking, then painted her mother's nails absorbedly with cherry ripe. They all 3 had the same small hands and feet, bony and fine, but the skin on Rose's hands was growing loose. They searched in the dressing table drawer for her green enamelled necklace and matching earrings. Her jewellery case was jumbled in with her girdles and stockings and brassiers and spectacles and used ration books, night dresses and knitted bed jackets, old letters and postcards and handkerchiefs and hairpins and boxes of pills. Somewhere in there, too, wrapped in tissue paper, was the long plait she'd cut off by herself with scissors when she was 16 because she wanted a Marcel wave in defiance of her parents. The sweet, stale smell of that drawer, face powder and wool and witch hazel, still had its mystique and suggestion of glamour for Rose's daughters. When they were children, they weren't supposed to go rummaging in their mother's things, and the dressing table had seemed a temple then, its back to the window, its bottle of Je Reviens by Worth, and its cut-glass ring tray and jar of cold cream, the crocheted lace doilies set under the glass top, the heavy hinged mirror sending their reflections jouncing vertiginously to the ceiling if they swung it, turning the room topsy-turvy. Doing Rose's lipstick now, Moira blotted her own lips together in demonstration, then stood behind her, judging her critically in the mirror, taking out her curlers and combing the fine dark chestnut hair into waves, spraying to hold them in place. Their father's girlfriend was supposed to be much younger and good-looking. But in that moment, they were all three hopeful, fastening on the green necklace and the earrings, hearing him arrive home through the side door.
Tessa Hadley, welcome to Shop Talk with Writers. Very happy to have you here, and we are recording this interview at Zedel's, Brasserie Zedel in Piccadilly, Soho, London, and in a very special room called Crazy Cox, where we are sitting on a stage where normally, there's a drum set and there's a grand piano. Normally you would hear music, jazz, maybe stand-up comedy. And it's interesting because your novel, the party that we are here to talk about today, actually has a lot to do with a much more rundown venue with jazz as well.
Yeah.
What year was it exactly? I saw it as post-war Bristol.
I sort of thought as I went through that it was 1950, but it's somewhere at the very early 50s. I did have particular pleasure in writing the line at the very beginning of the novella. She heard the sexy blare of the trad jazz, because I have to say that nobody now, as far as I know, thinks that trad jazz is sexy, but it so was in the early 50s.
And it was Bristol. Is there a personal connection you have with Bristol?
Yeah, that's where I was born and brought up, and that's where my parents, my dad was born there, and my mum came from the northeast of England, but came there as a teenager.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, your father was also a jazz trumpeter, among other things?
He was. So there's autobiographical elements I have stolen and misused in this story, most definitely. Actually, my mother died last year in December, but at a very good age. My dad had also lived a long time. And I think it was because of her going, I sort of kept her with me for a few extra months, and her younger sister, who also died. I kept them with me while I was writing this, even though, of course, fiction can't work and do justice to the infinite, opaque complexity of actual people. Or at least it does do justice to them, but not by being an exact representation. So this isn't my mother and my aunt, but it borrows things from them.
So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 of your earlier books here. Accidents in the Home, Everything Will Be All Right, Late in the Day, and a short story collection, After the Funeral. Accidents in the Home was
my first
novel. And I feel like everything you write could have that title, Accidents in the Home.
Yes, I know. I can remember writing that book was such a revelation. It was as if I got it. I knew how to make a novel. and I knew how to find a title. And when I found that title, I thought, oh, yes, and it's funny, and it sounds like, a first aid manual, but it's also the story of what happens to us in the life I know, which is, home, parents, children, lovers, marriages, work.
If your writing reminds me of anyone, it would be Lucia Berlin's short stories entitled a manual, speaking of manuals, a manual for cleaning women.
Yes, which is just one of my favourite books. She is a marvellous short story writer. And I have to say, I thought of Accidents in the Home before I'd ever read her, when she was rather in oblivion because she was republished later. I mean, the life she describes is much wilder than I often do. And I love that in her stories. I mean, real danger. And then she has that wonderful access. She sets quite a lot of her stories in Mexico, usually Americans in Mexico or Americans in Chile, because she had that in her own history to draw upon. And that gives a whole separate dimension.
What did you draw upon in your first fiction? Because you didn't publish in your 20s, you published a little bit later.
Yeah. I mean, that was the problem. I was writing all that time, writing and failing so miserably, and all of those early novels that weren't published are all in landfill. They're compost by now, thank goodness.
Are they really?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I'm so glad. I can hardly remember. I can remember what they were about. I'm not sure I can remember what they were called. I haven't asked myself that before. No, I can't. One of them was called, dear, I can hardly say it. It was called Crazy Salad, which is a brilliant quotation from Cleopatra, in Antony and Cleopatra. But my sons somehow got hold of, how did I let them know that? So they would so tease me about it every night, what's for supper tonight, Mum? Is it crazy salad? Until the very name sort of excruciates me. Those books, I was trying to write other people's books, and I was exactly trying. I mean, not literally, but I was as if I was trying to write Mexico and Chile. In my case, New Caledonia, actually. One of them was set there. What was I thinking of? And I was trying to write like other people, like the novelists whose books I was in love with and adored. But the wrong reaction to your adoration is to try and write like those people. You sort of have to, in the end, find your own home in writing, however small it seems to you, however, bourgeois and petit bourgeois life from the 1950s to the present day. Well, there we are. Lots has been written about that. But in the end, I think I sort of found there was something new to say about that, or at least that's what I tell myself.
I'm going to tell you something. In 2015, this was the year of your novel called The Past. My job then was a literary scout. So I worked as a scout for various publishers in different countries, and we used to do book reports for them. That was the job. And I worked together with a very interesting, very complicated young man from Scotland. So together, we wrote this report on your book, which I will quote from. And probably in 2015, if you may remember, your ears might have been burning if you had heard this. Here we go. Report, Tessa Hadley. June 2015, The Past. This was a book report and for client information only. Top secret, but today we don't care. So there is a summary of what happens in the book, but in the last two paragraphs, he wrote, and some of it was from me, I can't remember how we put it together, but these were the words. As far as I am concerned, Tessa Hadley is about as good as it gets. I have no idea why she's not a household name. She is a brilliant writer, completely in control of her craft. So often we see authors slithering around with their point of view, while Hadley grasps the nettle of reliable omniscience with both hands. The claustrophobia, fragility, and volatility of family life are captured here like nowhere else, except maybe Chekhov. She has turns of phrases which never take your breath away because they are so subtly concealed. There's nothing show-offish here. What is here is a writer who has the confidence and skill to allow her to embellish her work with beautiful touches. There are no big scenes or sentences, but everything is beautiful. Everything works.
Okay, my ears are burning. Wow, that's a beautiful tribute.
So I shared that with many publishers. I don't know what happened at the time, but that is how I feel today, still and again about your work. And I always ask myself, how does she do what she does? Because it all seems so effortless, so simple, and yet when it's a book, a story, a novel by Tessa Hadley, she's going to go all the way. However mildly a story might begin, it's going to end where it's supposed to, and it's going to go deep. And if it hurts, it's going to be painful. It's going to show and reveal everything. I heard a radio presenter say this on the radio this morning. She played some wonderful song, and she said, I could only lip sync to that. I could never sing it myself. And that's how I feel when I read you. I feel I could never do that. Because it's just too amazing, too unique. And so my question is, Tessa, after all of this, how do you do it? Where do your ideas come from? Because yes, it is family life. Yes, it is fragile. Yes, it is, I don't want to say common, but it's normal, regular life. It's what we experience every day. How do you see what's beneath and behind and inside of all that?
I mean, of course, I don't know. And I love you saying it, and it doesn't always feel like that when I'm doing it. I can remember actually looking at the proof copy of The Party, which, when it just came out a few months ago, and I just thought, well, it's so plain, But I suppose, in a way, very kindly, that's what you're liking in it, the plainness, and what am I doing? I mean, that's what I was doing wrong in that long 20 years or whatever it horribly was when I was failing. I was putting on the style. I was putting something on. I was faking it. And somewhere I can still remember in the first few short stories I wrote, and then in Accidents in the Home, the feeling that, oh gosh, I know what I know. But I hadn't found the words for what I knew. I didn't think it mattered enough. And suddenly I was in my own terrain, which is not always strictly autobiographical. This is one of the most autobiographical, the most stolen things. And even this, I mean, the whole of the third section is more or less invented. But nonetheless, I do know it because it's the kind of people I know, in the places I know, doing the things I know. And I guess I choose, I think in all that 20 years when I was wasting my time writing the wrong things, one of the problems was that I'm very impressionable rather than, at least at that point, authoritative. And I think I do soak stuff up. And I don't watch people with a notebook, God forbid, not at all, but I'm watching people thinking how amazing to be that, or how incredible to have that power, watching my dad, obviously, on the stage playing the trumpet and thinking, what does that mean, to hold this room in thrall, and at first not knowing how to write that, and then eventually sort of finding my way. So, yeah, it's being an immersive person. And then I do think something happened in my 40s. Several things contributed to it. One of them was growing older. That's good. That matures you. It's not good in other ways, but it's really good for writing. I also, this is a funny thing, it didn't occur to me till years later. I wrote a PhD of critical writing on Henry James, which was then published as a book. And I was really doing that as a fallback position because I thought, if I go on failing like this, I'm just going to have the most miserable life. So let me do this other thing that's easy and that I also like, but obviously not as much. And I think I rehearsed authority in those sentences that I wrote as a critic. Isn't that funny? But it didn't occur to me till such a long time afterwards. And suddenly I knew who I was. I've always as a critic, I've always been very confident, even as an undergraduate. I mean, probably ludicrously, not confident personally, but confident in what I had to say about books. So I think I practiced sounding like I knew what I had to say, and that I was doing that at the same time as writing Accidents in the Home. And I think the authority came to me through that.
So let's talk about this novella, which you mentioned in the acknowledgements that the first chapter, I believe, of it was published as a story in the New Yorker.
Yeah.
In exactly that same form?
No, Deborah Treisman cut it a bit because it was rather long. I think it was 10,000 words, which is longer than even the New Yorker does. I mean, it was always a novella, but even as I conceived of it, and it was one of those books that came to me it was suggested to me actually by my publisher that I should write a novella, and I sort of took no notice because I don't write what I'm told, but although she's so lovely and so wise, and it turns out she planted this seed, and I went home and suddenly I had a novella in my imagination. So when I planned it, I thought, be clever, because who knows whether it's going to work, and make the first chapter, which I could see the arc of it, should feel like a standalone short story. But when I tried it on the New Yorker, I didn't tell them there was any more. I didn't want to. I wanted to see, do they think it works? And they did. And then so it was some bits were cut out.
So what is the party really about? It's two sisters, very different. One of them seems more important from a narrative point of view because she's the one who's observing and experiencing most of it. But the other is very dominant. So Moira is the stronger one, perhaps. Yeah. And Evelyn is younger.
Yes.
And I don't know, somehow I felt that Evelyn was closer to yourself, maybe?
It's a funny thing. I mean, yes, that is the case in this story. Actually, if these are portraits at all, it's Moira who's my mum, the bossy, striking art student, dressmaker, as she became. I mean, they both completely messed up my real aunt and my real mother really messed up their time in higher education, which was no one in the family had ever done that before. I don't even know how they fell into it. Mum failed and my aunt got a third or something. They were just partying and having life. What was I? Oh, yes. So it was, I think I could only see the older sister by becoming, as it were, for most of the time, the younger one who watches this potent, powerful young woman who is, brusque and not always nice and opinionated. By the way, my mum was the most lovely person. I don't really mean, but she had those. She was a force, and she was like that with her younger sister, who I've slightly diminished in my treatment of her because she was more of a character almost than I've made Evelyn. She was more quirky, more eccentric, more wild. I give her a sense of humour in the book that was my aunt's when she says things like they're talking about whether their friend Vincent is attractive and Moira's delivered her awful verdict that he's NPA. No, he's not NPA, is he? But he's not attractive. And Evelyn says, he's sort of woolly somehow, like an old favourite toy. And that's the sort of thing my aunt might have said there. Very funny. Anyway, so yes, I've simplified and sweetened her a little bit, but I needed that angle to really focus my attention in a way on the older sister. And although she's so bossy and difficult in a way with her family, when she's there in the middle section, she's not always at home. She often stays in town with friends now she's a student. But she's at home. The whole family relaxes around her because she sort of makes them feel she's holding things together. And that was also true about my mum, I think.
I love the idea that the two sisters experience things at a young age, which will obviously affect the rest of their lives, both together and separately. And the idea that, for example, the younger one, Evelyn, is so bookish, perhaps, very interested in her studies, French. She dresses like someone from the left bank and is very intellectual and loves seeing herself that way, but has no sexual experience. And when she ends up having that, not with a man she likes at all, but just because it happens and it has to happen, she doesn't really mind. She understands somehow on some level, on a very interesting level, that experience is more important than the school experience.
Or that the deep part of the school, the university experience, the book experience, is telling her that she must live. And therefore, she is able... I mean, there's a moment in the novella where sort of after this thing has happened with the man she doesn't really like, she thinks there are two options. She can either think that was the most appalling drunken mistake and I'm ruined, because that was still just about, rubbish happened in the 1950s and girls were sort of ruined. Or you can choose not to be. You can shrug it off. That was life. That happens. It's in books. I've read about it, especially French books.
Exactly. And when she sometimes she sees herself as a character in a novel, and that would be a French novel probably.
Yeah, it would.
I love that because she's a character in a novel or novella, and she is talking about her own imaginary characters in the novels that she's read and that have influenced her.
Yeah.
So it's kind of fiction within fiction within fiction, and you do that so well because you make the fiction feel or seem very real to the reader. So I think maybe that's your magic, that's your magical touch. The way you make the very real seem magical and the very magical seem completely natural.
Okay.
I don't know how you do that. I honestly don't, but that's what you do.
I mean, I do have a joke with her book thing, in that when she's really reading, and she's a real reader, she's wearing the scruffiest things, her hair isn't washed, she curls up in a chair, she doesn't even know where she is. But when she goes to the university, she dresses up as an intellectual and puts a couple of books under her arm as a sort of prop, as an accessory.
She needs to look like one.
She looks like one, but of course that's the very moment when she's least like one.
Yeah.
That's just a nice joke.
And thinking about the period in which you set this novella, so this is the early sort of post-war period. Many of your characters, particularly the men, have been in a war. Some have not, but some have, or there's mention of those who have died. Yeah. They seem to be somehow present. They are not there. They have died, or they have been maybe maimed in psychological ways. But they are, even if they're absent, they are extremely present. It's almost like a two-tier world of those who are here and those who are gone, but are very much thought about.
I love you finding that in it, because I definitely meant that to be there. And I think that is, I was born a few years later, but even in my childhood, that it seemed very close, and one did know those people who'd been part of it, and they were set apart. And that's sort of part of the story of Moira and Evelyn's crowd, is that they're the first generation. They were children in the war. And they've sort of got to take back power and imagination from the heroism and the huge suffering of the very recent past, and the generation of men behind them, and particularly the men, have to sort of snatch that back. I mean, we don't see the men so much. And of course, the girl's father, I give him a proper heroic war past, even though he's pretty much a bastard in the present as far as we can piece him together, and a bully at home, really, in a patriarchal, old-fashioned way. But there you are, people are complicated, and maybe if you really are on a first lieutenant on an aircraft carrier escorting a merchant convoy across the Atlantic, well, who cares what you're like at home? You need in that moment to step up to your role as a brave man. So that's all of that stuff about who are we and what comes after a war. What does peace feel like? What are we going to do with this peace? I'm
It
interested
didn't
in
seem
that.
quite real to them yet.
No.
So peace
no.
meant going to this rundown pub, listening to jazz, losing yourself in awful drink and
Yes.
strange dancing, and men who you don't really want to rub up against.
Yes.
Peace meant then going home to your parents'
Yeah.
home, not having any money. Nobody had any
Yeah,
money.
yeah.
But then there's the moment when these two girls are confronted, are invited, or almost forced into being invited into this mansion that has been inherited by some posh young people who. So now suddenly we have a class barrier between the girls and these people they meet. And that's very, very interesting because that house, that mansion is empty because the actual young people who would have inherited it are dead
Yes. Yes.
in the war.
Yes. That's
And,
right.
and that house, I absolutely love that description and how you render this house as being almost alive with the deaths
With the-
and their
yeah.
possessions.
All the wardrobes
all
are
the
still
things
full
are
of the
there,
dead,
yes.
the drawers full of the dead man's clothes. It was funny. I hope this isn't a spoiler in any way, but she does lose her virginity. So there's a towel, a bloodstained towel. And my first draft of the book, I forgot about the towel. And then in a second, when I was reading through, I thought, oh my God, what does she do with that? And then I thought, I know, she puts it at the back of a drawer, hides it. I don't quite know from whom, but in a general sense that she ought to put it away out of sight. And the drawer is full of one of those dead young men's socks. And
Well, I mean, that moment was unbelievable. And this is when I thought, okay, this is Tessa Hadley. No one else would have created that particular conjunction of things, a moment of things. I have to mention something. My favorite, I know you teach creative writing.
I don't any longer.
You don't
I've
anymore,
retired
but
now,
you have.
I did it for 20 years.
My favorite book ever that no one has ever heard of on teaching creative writing was a book called The Human Nature of Playwriting by Samson Raphaelson, who was a very well-known playwright and screenwriter. And in 1946 or 7, maybe even 8 in America, he was asked by a friend to teach a creative writing course at a university in America, but he had never done that before. He had no experience and he didn't know how to go about it. So he came up with the idea of having a secretary sit in on all the classes and literally write down everything that was said by him and by the students. So this book is that.
Fascinating.
Absolutely fascinating. It's a perfect, yes, fascinating version of a course like that. It's called The Human Nature of Playwriting because his emphasis was that you cannot be a writer if you don't know who you are. So what he was teaching them, they came with highfalutin ideas about shape and form and narrative and structure. And he said, I don't know anything about that. I know how I work, and let's find out how you might work. And he said, talk to me about who you are. Mini biographies or bigger, he wanted to know about every single one of those
that's
students.
fascinating.
And most of these students, the reason I'm mentioning it now is they were survivors of the war. They had come from the war. The men from having been in the war and the women from having been not on the front, but on the other sort of receiving end of it, and the relationships that were affected by it. And everything came out of that.
Yes.
So in your novella, I can really sense that period, which wasn't your period, that's not what you grew up in, but that was it really captures that very well. And I suppose if books will be written, or when they are written, about our period, what we are going through will also be reflected in a similar way, in ways that we now don't yet see.
Yes.
What
I
do
mean,
you
you're
think?
raising so many interesting things there. And I mean, that's my hope for, that's what I find in the best realist tradition that I read, is that even if you capture what seems like the narrow stories of one class and the domestic stories that aren't the great politics of an era, they're not the great dramas of politics, but actually you capture the politics, the sociology, the anthropology of an era that later, 50 years later, if you're looking back to that time, And you can read every clue, which in its own moment seemed merely ordinary, but you can read every clue as having a kind of something to say. How was it to live in that interim between the two great wars? What was going on? And all the tiny details of daily life have clues in them, which you almost couldn't know at the time. And the artist records them and puts them down, but almost intuitively. But they turn out to be so pregnant, so full.
But only if it's art. If it's not good, if
Yes,
it's not good
yes,
writing,
yes.
it
You're
doesn't mean
right.
anything. But if
Yes.
it's good writing or
That's the
good
irony.
art, or
You-
a good
yeah,
film,
yeah,
then
absolutely,
it's timeless.
absolutely.
However time
Yes,
it may
yes.
be, but it is timeless.
Yes.
And that's what I admire in old films as well.
Or it's not timeless, it's very, very much of its time, but it
Yes.
speaks across time
Exactly.
to,
Yes.
to later readers.
Yes, you put it much better. Yes.
It's just that I'm always wary of timeless, because just like I'm wary of universal feelings, people often say, oh, love is always the same, whether it's 1850 or 1950. And I think, no, it isn't. Love, motherhood, growing up, everything is changed utterly over time. And yet, when we read Jane Austen, we really do feel huge kinship with her characters. But oh, what strange lives they live and how unlike ours. And it's that double response of identifying wholly, empathetically with her world, but I hope, registering how everything has changed. That's so important for our sense of ourselves as human beings. I mean, that's why reading is, and watching film and listening to music, but reading the prose fiction is such a rich store of empathetic knowledge about our past and about the variety of humanness. Speaks to us, but is unlike us.
I'm silent. I have nothing to add to that. That was absolutely perfect. Thank you so much for saying that. Thank you so much for writing all these books and now this new book. And what are you working on now?
I actually wrote a novel for 2 years that I then threw away. I haven't literally... No, it's a horrible... I don't know what I was doing. Isn't that funny? And that's a very interesting thing, only to me. What was I doing? How was I deluding myself? And then one day I knew. So that's gone. And I thought I would be very depressed, and I wasn't. I was just relieved. So then I started a new one, and I interrupted it, actually, to write this novella. Also, my mum was poorly and all of that. So that interrupted that novel. Then I wrote The Party. And then there came that very terrifying day when you think, right, time to get back to the novel. It's just an ordinary day. You have breakfast, you put the washing on, you go upstairs, you open the file on your computer and you think, is this alive? And it was alive. For me, it was alive. So this one, I'm now well into it, and I hope to finish it by the end of next summer.
Tessa Hadley, thank you so much for being on Shop Talk with Writers, and it was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it, and the readers will be excited to read The Party or any of your older books and your future new ones. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure. What a lovely talk.
You have been listening to the December episode of Shop Talk with Writers. I hope you enjoyed this and our earlier podcasts with authors Denise Dorrance, Chikosi Obioma, and Naomi Westerman. We are really looking forward to continuing our conversations in 2025 with Tom Lamont, John Banville, Ingrid Persson, Fiona Scarlett, Nick Harkaway, Daniel Kellman, Anne Goldstein, Megan Hunter, and Joshua Cohen. Here's a preview of Tom Lamont talking about his debut novel, Going Home.
You learn through the doing, so you're almost always slightly too far behind because you've done it now and you sort of learned from your mistakes. And I don't even think it's a case that you learn quick enough to help with the next child along after your first, if you do have a first, or if you do indeed have more. I think it takes longer to process than that somehow, the overwhelming experience of parenthood, and you only really realize in hindsight what mattered, what didn't, what you fretted about, what you should have been fretting about, what was a waste of your emotional energy.
Today's podcast is partly sponsored by Brasserie Zadel in Piccadilly Circus, where it was recorded in a beautiful, mostly red room called Crazy Coq's Cabaret and Bar. I have been in love with Zadel's ever since it opened as a French brasserie and cafe in 2012, when I had an office around the corner in Glasshouse Street. There's a buzzy and very relaxed atmosphere about Zadel's that is completely unlike any other venue. It is an architectural Art Deco gem in the heart of Piccadilly, originally built as the famous Regent Palace Hotel in 1915. It was the largest hotel in Europe at the time, with over 1,000 bedrooms. The style was that of a transatlantic liner, intended as a more democratic version of the Ritz. In the 1930s, the Beaux-Arts interiors were redesigned by British architect Oliver Percy Bernard, and this is what we still get to enjoy today when we dine at Brasserie Zadel in the basement of the former so-called Palace for the People. Next to the restaurant is the Bar Américain, and next to that is the intimate Crazy Coq's Cabaret and Bar. This is where Brasserie Zadel spoils us with a regular menu of stellar performances in music, theatre or comedy. Created out of a former billiard room, the Chez Cup Bar, as it was originally called, was described by a magazine in 1935 as just a trifle dissipated and naughty, but not sufficiently so to be vulgar. In 2024, we find this room just simply gorgeous. I love inviting friends to Brasserie Zadel for the delicious food and drink, the fun ambience, and the performances. When you visit Zadel's once, you always come back. It is 21st century Soho at its best. We'll be back in January. Happy holidays and happy reading.